Hey, everyone! Welcome back to our what are we? We're last three sessions now. Oh, we're nearly there, nearly at the end of the event. Thank you for joining us. Do let us know in the chat where you're joining from, what you're looking to get out of the session, and throughout the session, please do keep engaging with each other, sharing ideas, answering questions, asking questions along the way as well. I'll be in the chat, so feel free to reach out there. But without further ado, I'm going to stop wasting time because you're not here to listen to me. Rebecca, the stage is yours.
Excellent. So hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. We're going to talk about crafting inclusive learning experiences and how to actually design e-learning, learning in general for neurodivergent learners. So as Tom mentioned, my name is Rebecca Prejean. I actually am right outside of Austin, Texas, and I've been in learning and development for right around 10 years or so, doing everything from video to animations. I also have a background in graphic design, so I'd like to do all the artsy type of things. A little bit about my journey into neurodivergent learning and accessibility. I myself am not neurodivergent. However, I do have a neurodivergent son. His name is Ethan, and he's 7, and he has autism. And part of what has interested me so much in this learning journey for neurodivergent learners is seeing him and some of his struggles and challenges, from the way people view him and his capabilities to learn and understand, to just our struggle to get him support and actually, kind of lift him up and give him the things that he needs. So as I started to see that struggle, I really started to think about what I do on a daily basis and the people that I interact with, the learners I create things for. Because even though, we specialize in adult learning, most of us here, that isn't too different from what we're seeing kind of on the child side of things. And I really started to want to make purposeful learning and actually reach everybody where they are. So I have started to really delve into accessibility, and I've learned a few things along the way. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. It's just some of the things that I've seen, some of the things that have worked for me with my clients, and things of that sort. So with no further ado, let's begin. So we're going to break this session down into 4 pieces: the what, the why, the how, and then like the what's next. So first, we're going to look at what is neurodivergency, what conditions are included in this distinction. Then we're going to look at why accessible learning is actually important. So why you should actually care. I'm sure most people who come to conference sessions like this, a lot of people you may know in your organizations, they care, they want things to work well for accessible learning, but there's reasons behind that. It can't just be passion. There has to be some reasoning behind all of that, right? So we're also going to look at the how we as L&D professionals can actually impact the needs of our neurodivergent learners, how we can meet them where they're at, support them the way they need to be supported, and bring them through to the bridge of success. And then we're going to talk about what's next. So we're going to go through all this information. We're going to talk a little bit, but what can you do on your end after all this is said and done to make those first steps and move forward in your progress for your organizations? I'm pretty open. Feel free to ask questions during the presentation if that's your pleasure. If you don't want to and you kind of want to see what's happening during the presentation and then ask questions, I'm fine with that as well. Pretty flexible on that. So let's actually get started with what is neurodivergency. So the way that I view it is like this. You'll hear a few things when you start talking about neurodivergency. You'll hear the term neurodiversity, and then you'll hear neurodivergent, and then you'll hear like ADHD, autism, all these different things. I'm a firm believer that before you can really tackle some of the different things and some of the minutia, you need to understand and have a foundation of what we're actually dealing with and what we're talking about. So neurodiversity, when you hear that, I want you to think of it as the concept. So it's the concept of people being able to learn differently. In that sense, everybody is neurodiverse. We all think differently. We all learn differently. We all have different perspectives, different views. Really, we are all neurodiverse from one another. When we start getting into the individual, we start getting into these different things like ADHD, autism, dyslexia, dyscalculia. That is when you're talking about neurodivergent, because we're talking about the individual and the person. So as you're in your organization, as you are thinking about accessible learning, accessible experiences, I want you to have two different realms of thought. So obviously, if we're implementing a program, we're going to want to think about the concept of neurodiversity and trying to make sure that we attack things from different angles. When we start talking about specifics, like what do people that may have ADHD, what do they maybe need to be successful? That's when we're going to start talking about neurodivergency in and of itself. So, kind of also want to give you a little bit more of the foundation here. And yes, this does allude to some of the why, but I also want you to think a little bit more about what it might be like to be neurodivergent in the workplace that we're in right now. The world that we're in is different, it is forever changing, and it is forever growing, as I'm sure you all are aware. Now, 58% of autistic adults have only ever been employed outside the home. So that's worded a little strange, but I'll go ahead and clarify it for you. So I want you to think in the general workforce, you know, we all go to work. Most of us have jobs. We all do our thing. And that's pretty much standard. For people who are autistic, however, there's a lot of stigma. And so it's a little harder for them to be employed. It's harder for them to gain employment, so to speak, because people look at them and they think, well, if you're autistic, you're not going to be able to maybe keep up, or you're not going to be able to do X, Y, and Z. That is a shame, but it is a reality. I remember when my son was first diagnosed with autism. Quite frankly, to be honest and transparent, I was scared because I didn't really know what that meant. Sometimes when you see the concept of autism and you hear people talk about it, you don't hear about the range of things that you can see with it. You hear about like the more extreme cases. So maybe people who are nonverbal, can't live on their own, can't do certain things that we consider, you know, typical behavior. So when you have that kind of thought process in your mind, if you are somebody who's hiring people, you may be more apprehensive to hire somebody who's autistic. Absolutely doesn't make it right, but that is the thought process that goes into it. Additionally, neurodivergent individuals in general have around about a 40% unemployment rate. So that's going to be in stark contrast to the atypical or neurotypical folks who are employed. You know, right now, yes, there's a high unemployment rate, but I guarantee you the majority of people who are unemployed right now are probably neurodivergent. Because again, people are hesitant to actually hire them. And we have that stat here as well, whereas 50% of employers are hesitant to hire neurodivergent employees. I want to point something out about that. That particular statistic was actually out of a journal based out of the UK. And while I have many UK friends, and I will honestly say they are some of the most honest people I've ever met, they'll tell you exactly what it is, and they don't feel bad about it at all. I will say that I would not be surprised if that number is similar in the US. We just happen to be a little less ready to actually say those things aloud because we know that's not okay. So I would not be surprised if that number is still the same. And when you think about that as a barrier, if nothing else, that is going to stop any kind of real accessibility growth in an organization because your people, your leadership is already hesitant to even take that step. So they're not even thinking about, well, if I do hire one, how do I support them? Because they're like, well, I prefer to just not hire them in the first place, which is not the right way to go. And then you have 51% of neurodivergent employees that want to quit their jobs. These are not folks who are lazy or just don't want to work or just don't want to do things. Neurodivergent employees want to work. They want to achieve things. They want to be successful. They want all the things that neurotypical people want to do. That's just the reality of it. But they want to quit their jobs because they're not supported. They don't feel supported. They don't feel seen. They don't feel heard. And how can they if we're not even looking to their needs or looking to what may actually help them be successful? So as we take the rest of this journey, I want you to take these numbers into consideration and really start thinking about how you are supporting your people and kind of how you can affect these numbers in your role on a daily basis. So why accessibility? I feel like the answer is readily available, but I want us to kind of go through it a little bit and think about when you're, yeah, the statistics are very shocking. To be quite honest with you, I was shocked when I looked at them. I was like, that is staggering. But as we go through this next part and we talk about accessibility, I want you to think about the impact that inclusive learning can have and how it can really change not only the success of an individual, but also the success of an organization and really even the culture of these workplaces that we're in. So let's talk about some different challenges. As a neurodivergent human, you are going to have different challenges based off of your specific condition, kind of the level it's at and all of these different things. But you're generally going to have, there's four. I have three here, but there's usually about four. So think sensory, executive function, and focus, right? So if you are sensorial in that nature, if that is your challenge space, you might be hypersensitive to light, hypersensitive to movement, hypersensitive to sound. And as you know, as we're making things, we're creating all the things as designers in the learning and development world, we tend to gravitate a lot towards movement, sound, just different things, right? We like a lot of razzle dazzle. But for neurodivergent learners, that's not necessarily the best way to go. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But these are some of their challenges, right? So these are some of the things they come up against. And if they don't have that support, if we're not thinking from an accessible standpoint, we are automatically setting them up to have a tougher time than they would really need to have. Same thing with executive function. We talk about time management, especially for folks with ADHD, some impulsivity that's there, and then just kind of that working memory. Things that, again, we take for granted that our learners are going to be able to manage. We have asynchronous courses. We're like, go take them. Go take them during your time that you have, even though you may not have a lot of time, but figure out a way to fit it in. And that's not necessarily going to set a neurodivergent learner who struggles with their executive functioning, down the path that they need to go down. And then, of course, there's focus. You'll have distractions, maintaining their attention, sometimes hyper-focusing. We talk about gamification a lot. That is the new thing. Virtual reality is a really new shiny toy that we're all playing with, augmented reality. And even as cool as it is, we can absolutely have a problem where they start hyper-focusing. So they lose the attention on the objective, and now they're looking at this one thing. My son comes up a lot when I use examples because, hey, I see him every day and I've started to create things for him to play around with. And he absolutely hyper focuses a lot to the point where if he is on something that is gamified, he will sometimes get answers wrong because he's so focused on the wording or the sound or something that happens, during the course of that engagement. So it can be something just that simple that throws them a little bit. And that doesn't make them wrong. It just makes them different. And it makes us responsible for having to kind of think through some of that in a much more purposeful way than we tend to do. It's horrible for cognitive load when we start talking about sound effects. And again, I do love some razzle dazzle. I love sound. I love motion graphics. It's what I started off doing. I've just started to do it more purposeful and give some more options that we'll talk about. So this number is also staggering. 26% of neurodivergent learners don't feel their training needs are met. I want you to think of it not just from that 26%, but I want you to think of it as your workplace. If I told you over a quarter of your learners are not feeling like their training needs are met, that is a tough number to swallow. And it's a tough number to swallow for a lot of reasons, because these are people who are interacting with clients, they're interacting with partners, they're interacting with different departments, and they do not feel equipped to do their job. that is a problem on multiple levels, especially when we talk about what is happening in the economy today. We are seeing layoffs at a staggering rate. We are seeing businesses who are like, well, we're losing money, big names that you wouldn't even expect to have that happen. They're losing money, they're losing traction, they're losing ground, and this number is not going to help. If you are not running on all cylinders as a company, how can you expect to be successful? You can't. Like, you'll be successful for a little bit, but maintaining that success will be very difficult and very complicated. So when we talk about why accessibility is important, it's not only for the individual because, we can impact them in a really great way, but it's also, quite frankly, so that we can make sure that people get what they need and companies can stay afloat and we can all maintain jobs. Because I don't know about you, but I have bills to pay. So I like working, and we need companies that can actually stay afloat. And part of the way we do that is making sure that everybody gets the learning that they need. So the impact of accessibility, can be really, really profound. We talk about things like performance, innovation and creativity, and retention. So performance, if there's accessible learning that's present, if it's built in, if it's baked in, you can actually increase productivity of neurodivergent individuals by up to 30%. It's about what you see on the average, which is huge. That doesn't just mean they're sitting doing work, they're also sitting thinking. So they're able to be more creative because they don't have all of those stressors. They don't have all of that worry, all that anxiety built up within them. So they can actually increase their innovation, their creativity by about 20%. So bringing new ideas to the table, all of these different things that, like I alluded to a moment ago, is super important in the world that we're in right now. Businesses are learning how to actually do things different. But you can't do things different if you don't do anything different. If you just have the same 20 people sitting at the table from like 5 years ago and nobody's bringing any new ideas because they've just been sitting in the same environment, you're not going to get anything different. Neurodivergent learners, for me, are kind of that next frontier. They are the ones who will give us the information. They are the ones who will give us the ideas, the creativity, the innovation to move into those next sectors of business. And then we're also talking about retention. All those folks who want to quit their jobs because they're not supported, you can increase that retention by up to about 15% from what it currently is. And again, that affects everything else, right? Because you have more people who are performing, more people who want to be at work, who want to do good work, who can do good work because they're supported. And they can also bring some new ideas, some new processes, some new thoughts, and actually make that work environment what we all want it to be. And of course, the bottom line, as much as I love what I do, as much as I love accessibility, I love empowering neurodivergent learners, I am highly aware that the bottom line is where a lot of companies live. I know people don't like to talk about it, but it is the reality of the situation. For people to gain some buy-in for accessibility, for neurodivergent advocacy, you really do have to speak to the pocketbooks. It is what it is. But the good thing is you can do that, because accessibility, if you actually champion that and have that baked into your framework, you can actually see a revenue increase of 28 to 30%. And again, in today's economy, especially over here in the US, that is major. That can be the difference between your company growing, thriving, pushing through some of the things that we've seen, to being one of many companies that we've recently seen that are either folding, laying people off, or just really, really floundering and struggling. So when we talk about why accessibility is important, it's important for the learner, but it's also important for everybody else. It really does create a workplace, an environment that is full, it is thoughtful, it is successful, it's innovative. It's all the things that people say they want their workplace to be, but struggle to get there. This is how you get there, by making sure that people have what they need to actually learn and succeed. And how do we as L&D professionals actually address these things? So we've talked about all the things, right? We've talked about the challenges, talked about why it's important, what it is, all the stuff. How do we address this? Quite frankly, I think it's almost as simple as this to a certain extent. So I believe that yes, there are design strategies, there are best practices, but I think the initial thing will always be to change the mindset that we have. So, as somebody who is neurotypical, I go through my life, I go through my day, just kind of like, yeah, I love that video. That video is great. It's moving, it's doing all these things, it's engaging. One of our buzzwords that we tend to have in the L&D space, that is my perception. But my perception as somebody who's neurotypical is very different from the reality of somebody who's neurodivergent. And so when I talk about changing the mindset, I mean changing it from what we perceive as true, what we perceive as factual from a neurotypical standpoint, and letting that be the standard, to actually really thinking about the reality and incorporating that into our thought process. So, again, what we can kind of view as great can actually be cluttered, tedious, or even unengaging for somebody who's neurodivergent. I'll use video because, again, video is something that you see a lot of nowadays. People talk about it a lot. They're like, video, video, video. And while it's great for a neurodivergent learner, it can be cluttered, it can be distracting with our motion graphics, it can have all that cognitive load that's there when we talk about voiceovers and music. And I'm not saying any of those things are bad. I'm not even saying to completely cut them out. There are ways to make that accessible to those who want it, while also taking care of your neurodivergent learners. But in general, we sit in a room. Some of us are neurodivergent, some are not. And we pretty much say, well, this is a lot of reading, or this, maybe we should just do an animation here because it would look really cool. We don't necessarily think about the purpose behind it. We just think it looks cool. And while that is a thought process that people have, it's not necessarily going to get folks where they need to go for learning purposes and for retaining that knowledge. So changing the mindset that we have in this space, I think, is key when it comes to actually implementing everything else. Like taking that split moment to figure out, is this just what I want, or is this something that can also be modified for accessibility and reach the folks that we need to reach? I also recommend, and this is something I recommend to any of my clients that sit down and ask me, Rebecca, what should we do to enhance the accessibility within our learning and development program? I believe in creating a playbook, just like every football team, I'm a football fan, so sorry about that, has their own playbook, their own, kind of list of things. I believe in creating a playbook for accessibility. Now, this playbook is going to be a little different from the folks that are on the field, but it needs to be focused on short and long-term goals, asking and answering some very tough questions within your organization, and finding solutions. And when I say finding solutions, I don't mean like a final solution. I mean starting to think down that path of, these are the things that I'm seeing with my learners. These are the things that maybe I'm hearing, or the things that I'm noticing. How can I maybe solve for that? Even if it's not like a final big picture solution, what are some little things that we can do to kind of make this easier and kind of give in some more support? When I say answering tough questions, I mean being very honest and transparent with yourself about what have we done with accessibility up to this point. If you say absolutely nothing, don't worry. I promise you are in pretty familiar company with a lot of organizations. I have worked with a couple of companies that they are household names. Um, there are people with things, I promise you, most households have something of these companies in their homes. I have consulted with them, and they have absolutely said, we've never had an accessible course. We've never had any captions. We've never had any alt text. We've never had anything. And it's not because they're bad people. It's because, number one, when they first built their program, they weren't thinking about it because it was, like 40, 50, 60 years ago. And since then, they don't know how to actually do the things. They don't have any goals for it. They just know, we want to start adding in accessibility. And that's what they've got. So the best way to do that is to create some very small, easy goals. Even if it's, let's add captions to the next video that we make, or let's start adding alt text to our presentations. Those things are super, super tiny in our minds, but they can be massive improvements for folks who are neurodivergent and who have been seeking some kind of support from, their L&D teams. A few best practices. If we break down everything we've talked about a little further, there are specific things that you can do for, some of our more popular design elements. I picked out video, e-learning, and animation because that's really what I work with every single day, whether it's Camtasia, Beyond, Powtoon, Articulate, Storyline or Rise or Adobe Captivate, whatever the case may be. These tend to be the areas where we all live a lot. So I wanted to kind of take a little bit of time just to kind of address these and talk about these. So for video, I would like for people to start focusing a little bit on having reteaching moments. So if you're making a video in Camtasia, you're going through all these different sections. Some people will actually put quizzes in their Camtasia files. Perfectly fine. I'm all about it. I love it. Allowing people, maybe if they miss a question, to go back and relearn to a certain cue point is something that you can do. Even if, let's say, there isn't a quiz in your Camtasia file, and you're just like, well, I don't need quizzes there. That's not a problem. You can still have an option to create a cue point where people can go back and hear that information again, especially if it's important, because some folks who are neurodivergent, they need to hear things a few times, repeatedly, for them to actually be like, okay, now I get it. Now I understand it. And I want you to think of it as, we're talking about employees a little bit here, or a lot, I should say, but this also goes for leadership. We forget that sometimes there are neurodivergent leaders who are in these organizations who are also struggling because their neurotypical, team members don't understand or know that they're neurodivergent. And so they may take their leaders, words or actions personally, but it's really just, again, an example of their neurodivergency and their differences. So if you are doing leadership development in particular, it would behoove you to have these reteaching moments where they can go back and access that information. Likewise, you should also have a little bit of a different way for them to see that information. Maybe it's something that opens like a link in a web browser, whatever the case may be. It's about giving variations and giving variety. Same thing with narration and just overall stimuli. Again, you don't have to cut out all the fluff. It's making it purposeful. As a visual designer, I fully believe in using a lot of art concepts like balance, composition, all of those things to actually make learning assets and learning, courses and experiences. And I like that approach because it really does keep me a little bit more in check. So instead of me wanting to do like 50 million graphics, I'll be able to be like, okay, that's a little heavy. So let me cut out this and let me make this more accessible in some way, shape, or form. So when you're talking about video, I want you to think of, yes, having things that are going to be appealing visually, because we all kind of go through that visual stimuli situation, but making sure that when we do it, it's with purpose. So maybe it's, I'm adding this graphic over here, but maybe there's a link to something that will take me into a website where I can learn more about it. There's just purpose in what we're doing as opposed to just throwing everything at the wall. When we talk about e-learning, huge, right? Everybody is all about e-learning nowadays. We're all doing all the clickable interactions with HTML5 and all this stuff. Fantastic things. You should make sure that your people know about accessibility controls, especially if you're building an articulate storyline. You should also talk about, again, variety and variations of things. So one thing that I have done for my clients within the last 2 or 3 months is creating like an actual base. So for me, I've created like my library of templated files and things that I can use for my clients. These particular templates are my base when I'm creating something. And it essentially lets people strip down the course so that it's more accessible. So I'll have clients that are like, well, I want the shiny things, or it's just not giving enough of X, Y, and Z. Oh, it is, I won't lie to you, it is hard to find ways to feed that in projects. But what I've done is I give the options. So for me, I've made myself learn JavaScript, but learn it in the context of Articulate, because at that point, I can control a lot of what happens. So instead of me just deciding, well, it's all going to be basic or it's all going to be really, really interactive and engaging, I literally have buttons, not a ton, just so you know, just not a ton, but I have some buttons that will either take things off or put things on so they get a more customized experience. And so for me, that's how I kind of allow them to feed that need, because there's always going to be some people who don't want that dopamine fix that's in there. There's going to be that. Like my son will have days, as a matter of fact, where he is really, really, really needing to see things, needing to like be active. And then there are days where he's just like, I can't do it. So yeah, exactly. The neurodivergent learners that I have, you know, experienced, I have worked with, the companies I've worked with, they are really, really good about saying, I need this. And then there are some that they don't say that at all. And that's perfectly fine. You should not have to disclose anything to get support, right? That's not what we want them to have to do. But I do see a lot of people wanting to be in control of their own experiences and wanting to be like, if I need a minute to not see all the things, I want to be able to have that freedom and that autonomy. And so that's something I would recommend. You don't have to be an expert developer, folks. I will never be an expert developer. That's not my thing. And when I say developer, I mean like HTML coding. Crazy respect to the people who do that as their daily jobs. It's fantastic. For me, I learned it more as a need to know skill so that I have more control for my learners. When it talks about animation, I want you to think again, we do so many things like Beyond, Powtoon, amazing, amazing options, right? Really fun things. However, it can be a little true statement. Very true statement. It can be a little hard for folks who are neurodivergent to sometimes grab on to concepts, because when you're looking at something through Beyond, if you notice, like there are some concepts that look a little abstract, even to me, and I'm neurotypical. And I'm like, I think that's a bell, and I think that's a this. You know, I'm able to kind of work that out a little bit, but with our neurodivergent folks, sometimes they don't have that built in. And so I always like to say with animation, you need to again go with purpose. Is this the right way to do this? Is this going to be clear enough? And if it's not, how do we strike that balance? Is it still an animation video, or is it an animation video mixed with a regular video? Because nowadays you kind of have that animated avatar feel with real video type of stuff, which is perfectly fine. I'm not judging. People do what they do. But it's about moving forward with real purpose and real thought when we talk about these animations. We have to move out of a place of this looks really cool and animation is fun to, is this going to actually benefit the majority of our learners, even the ones who don't disclose, because they shouldn't have to disclose to be successful. And the one last thing I will say in this section is talking a little bit more and thinking through assistive technology. In all honesty, I feel like when we talk about accessibility, when we start talking about assistive technology, like screen readers, for example, things get a little scary for some of us. Because you're like, I don't use that. So I don't really know what that is. And I'm really scared that when I have this screen reader read my course, it's going to be a mess, all this different stuff. But I do feel like for us to be able to really meet our neurodivergent friends where they are and give them what they need, we need to become a little bit more comfortable with the concept and the thought and the usage of assistive technology. So thinking web accessibility standards, color contrast, software that can kind of make sure, okay, this is good for them, that kind of situation. But there are actual free tools that you can use to make this stuff happen for you. I used to think, ignorantly, of course, that I can't see what happens with the screen reader if like I don't use that on a daily basis, or we don't have somebody that, has a screen reader. I didn't even really know what those were, if I'm being completely honest. I had no idea what they were when I started in learning and development. And a lot of people don't, because, we don't have that experience. And sometimes instead of saying, I don't know what this is, can you help me learn about it? Or seeking that information out, we're like, I'm just not going to touch it. I'm just going to pretend like it's not a thing until it has to be a thing. And we have to stop allowing that. So think free software like NVDA, it's completely open source, but it'll allow you to see whether or not your course makes sense to a screen reader. So you'll actually be able to figure out, okay, can somebody who needs a screen reader actually make it through my course successfully? Like, are they going to be able to navigate it? And I'm going to tell you that's a game changer, because you really start to realize how many unnecessary things you have in some of your courses. And I'm being honest with you, it almost makes you a better designer, better developer, because you start thinking about things in a very different way. Thinking about things like web accessibility evaluation tools, or WAVE, will help you kind of confirm the accessibility of your web content. Nowadays we have like HTML5, and some folks don't have LMSs. So we're doing things with links, but we never stop to check or think, is this going to be okay for somebody who needs, accessibility support? So by kind of dipping your toe a little bit, I'm not saying you have to jump into the deep end, but by dipping your toe into this a tiny bit, you will substantially increase the success of your learners. And that's really what this is all about. That's really all I'm talking about today, is meeting your learners truthfully where they are and not having to ask all these crazed questions about, their personal situation that they might not want to answer and quite frankly shouldn't have to. I know that there will come a time where my son will have to make those choices on his own about if he wants to disclose, how much he wants to disclose. But the one thing I want him to see, and the one thing that I'm hoping to implement everywhere that I go and with the people I touch, is that we want them to be successful regardless of how they feel, regardless of what stage in the journey they're in, because you'll also have folks who might suspect that they're neurodivergent, but they don't really know. Like back in the day, I'm almost 40, but back in the day, we really didn't have a bunch of testing for all these different things. And so maybe they just haven't gotten tested. Maybe they don't have the means to get tested. You shouldn't have to go that far to feel like you have to be successful at work. So how can you take some of this information we've talked about today, and move forward? How can you kind of make your next steps? Like, what does that look like for you as an L&D professional? Obviously, I'm always going to say this, start small. Like, I have had people, and I actually had a consultation yesterday. It was fun. It was two ladies, and they were like, we are really, 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 really passionate about creating a neurodivergent learning program for our business, which is super great, super cool. It's going to teach people how to interact with neurodivergent employees and, kind of cues and all these different things. And they were amped. And I love it. It's fantastic. But they wanted to go like full throttle. And they're like, well, we don't even really know where to start because, there's all these different levels of accessibility and neurodivergency, and how do we measure, how much people know and all this stuff. And I stopped them and I said, let's pull back for a minute. Let's start small. Let's start with the basics. And that's because you're always, always, always going to have folks who either don't know about neurodivergency or could really use just a nice little level set foundational moment. And so instead of looking at this massive thing about, well, I want to do this and I want to meet my learners, but now I have all these previous trainings that don't have any accessibility in them, and we don't have a bunch of time to build in a ton of stuff for accessibility. Like, we have all these other projects, but I want to do it now. Instead of thinking about all of those things and throwing yourself into the lurch, start small. It doesn't have to be an accessibility takeover overnight. It will not be an accessibility takeover overnight. It will be something that will take time. It will be something that takes buy-in. You will be advocating in some cases, and it will be very personalized to the organization that you work with. But even something like we talked about earlier, adding in a couple of captions for a video. They have free software that does it. It is not a hard ask in most cases. Pretty simple to do. Start including that alt text. Start being purposeful in your designs. Start asking yourself those questions of, what am I really doing this for? What is the purpose of this? And how can I translate this so that maybe the color contrast is different? Maybe, the actual balance or composition of this is different. And maybe, lighter on the eyes. Those small things will get you to a bigger place over time. Because then as you start to implement these itty bitty things, you'll start to see more and more successes. And then you'll actually be able to get that buy-in that's so important and sometimes so difficult to get. Even though, leaders might want to implement it, they themselves are coming from a place a lot of times of, I don't really know where to start. Sometimes you have to be the one to show them where to start. And something this simple and this small is something that you can start with, and you don't have to have a major plan with it. So start small in the hopes that as time goes on, you'll get your buy-in, but in the guarantee that you'll start to see more successes. I also like to encourage people, learn about your workplace culture. You may think you already know about it, but I want you to start thinking about it in terms of accessibility and neurodivergence. Is that something that you hear about? Is that something that people talk about? That if you really are honest with yourself, would you be honest and able and open to disclose that information about yourself? With your coworkers, like, is that the workplace culture you have? Or do you have something very different from that? That helps you to kind of determine what avenues you may need to take if you're one of those folks who is like, well, I want to gain information before I start doing this and before I start going down this road. Knowing your workplace culture will help you figure out that first step, because what you don't want to do is throw out this crazy survey about neurodivergency, asking people questions like, what is your experience with neurodivergence? Like, do you have friends that are neurodivergent? All of these things. It'll stop you from doing that if you know that your workplace culture is not about the open, right? Know where you work and educate yourself. Take the time. It doesn't have to be a lot of time either. It doesn't have to be a bunch of crazy books or like a crazy like doctoral dissertation when it comes to educating yourself about accessibility and universal design. Just an article here and there, just things that kind of make you start kind of processing a little different, thinking a little different. It will become a habit over time. I absolutely promise you that. And then gradually optimize. I've said it 100 times and I will continue to say it until I'm blue in the face and you're tired of hearing me say it. Slowly do things with this. I'm not saying people don't need it. Obviously, I believe that they need it. I see that they need it. Like the reasoning is in my own home, usually running around. But you will need to slowly do things. Number one, so you're doing it right. And number two, so you can start to measure some differences and start building that case that you want to build to actually gain buy-in so that you can maybe get them to give you a few more extra fun toys when it comes to, designing for accessibility, and maybe send you to conferences where they talk about accessibility and stuff like that. So it's about slow rolls, folks, when it comes to this. This is like an Ironman marathon. It is not like a 100-meter dash at the end of the day. But ultimately, when it comes to accessibility, it comes to designing for folks that are neurodivergent. It is really taking yourself into a different place of trying to understand other people and what they see and what they think and planning for that. So with that being said, if anybody has questions, I'm open to hearing them. I'm always available via email. I do have a website. It is under reconstruction for the weekend, while I add a few different things, a few resources or whatnot. And of course, you can always find me on LinkedIn. But I talk about accessibility all the time, and it is the hill that I will absolutely die on. So if you ever have questions about accessibility, questions like quick questions that might come up, kind of in your own daily stuff, I'm always available for, a quick chat or something.
Wow. Thank you. That was phenomenal. I think there was so much in there for so many of us to take away. So if you've got any questions, now is the time. Get them in the chat. This is a topic that we discussed this earlier, but this just doesn't come up on a regular enough basis. And unfortunately, it tends to fall to people like yourself with a very personal experience that then end up having to drive the conversation. So I think, as I said at the start, there's a lot more we can all be doing. I definitely agree. This was amazing. Lovely comments coming through. Here we go. Good question. Have you been able to do analysis to see return on investment from an effectiveness perspective? So of doing this sort of best practice.
Yes, I have. And so just to kind of give you an idea, I'm a freelance consultant. Like that's what I do on a daily basis. So when somebody is hiring me for this type of work, what we do is we create their plan, but we also end up creating like the evaluation process through that. So we'll have like, you want to implement this course, you want this to be accessible. Fantastic. Let's make sure that we are measuring beforehand what's happening. We're measuring after, but we're also coming back later. So I always recommend that, as weird as it sounds for me to say this, even though we don't see it a lot, that people don't just do like a pre-test and a post-test right after. You also kind of check back in, maybe in about 3 months, give or take, and see how folks are doing with that information. And as you do that over time, if you start to implement that with all of your courses that you're making accessible, all of those experiences, you'll be able to see the difference between kind of maybe what was at one point and then what is actually, kind of happening. And that is another way, quite frankly, to establish that business case for folks to really start saying, yes, we need to do more of this because our people are doing so much better and therefore our business is doing better. Great question.
No, absolutely. I think it kind of speaks to that ongoing point where I think we're being challenged more, and it's a good thing, I think, overall, to kind of show that value back to the business, right?
Yeah.
And I think when we historically, where we've maybe struggled to get businesses to agree to give us resource to make these good things happen, being able to speak that language goes a really long way.
Yeah.
Great. Anything more question wise in the chat? Because if not, I agree with all of you. And Jane, thank you for joining us again. This has been so phenomenally useful. So please do sort of show your appreciation on LinkedIn. Obviously, head over to Rebecca's website, hit the like button on this video, share it so that more people can hear the things that we've been shared with us here. Because this was there's a lot I need to go and have a think about now about what we can do to make a positive change. Are you able to share where you got the stats from that you
Yeah.
shared during the presentation?
Yes, several places. Let me go back. Yeah, like there are several places. What I can do is I can post it on my LinkedIn because
Brilliant.
that will probably save us some time or whatnot.
Fantastic.
So if you actually like go to my LinkedIn, I will show that to y'all. Make sure to share that probably this weekend. But there were about 4 or 5 different sources that I used for those statistics.
Brilliant. I'll keep an eye out for those as well, and I'll post them in a comment attached to this video so that people can find them, and a link out to that LinkedIn post so that they can find you as well, Rebecca. So I think it's I think you're exactly right, Jim. If we can say this is where the stats come from as well, we can go into those boardrooms confident that we're backed up with the facts, right? It's gonna make the argument that much stronger. Amazing. Well.
Yes.
Thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
Thank you guys for having me. Like, I love it.
You're always very welcome to share this kind of thing here anytime at all. It's so incredibly interesting. And thank you everyone for being so involved in the chat and joining us and spending so much time with us today. We do have 2 more sessions. Our next one is at 6 o'clock GMT, so in about 25-ish minutes, somewhere in that. That feels about right. Yeah, 25 minutes on making space for simple solutions. And then we will be at our very last session of the day, which is coming up really quickly. We are nearly there. So penultimate session, get my favorite word in there, make the most of it again today. It's only really 3 days of the year I get to use it. And we will see you all then.
Right. Bye, everybody.
iSpring is an e-learning software provider dedicated to streamlining e-learning worldwide. With a team of top industry specialists, they create tools that make e-learning both efficient and enjoyable. Their AI-powered course creation tool, iSpring Suite, and the iSpring Learn LMS are the top choices for thousands of instructional designers, L&D pros, and content developers. Crafted with the user workflow in mind, iSpring ensures a seamless experience for the creation of impactful learning content. Their website, iSpringSolutions.com, offers a treasure trove of e-learning resources perfect for those seeking to boost their L&D career or elevate their organization's e-learning practices. You can check out the iSpring Solutions website using the link in the description below.